For the arts.
This is 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:06 and it's Friday. That means it's time for KUOW's Week in Review.
You made it to Friday. Welcome to it. I'm Bill Radke, and it's great to have you along as always. This is the hour at the end of the week where we figure out what happened this week and what it all means. And we do that with a panel of journalists, which today includes Publicola criminal justice reporter Paul Kiefer. Paul, welcome back. Good to see you.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And when I say see, again, I literally can see Paul and all my guests because we're on Facebook and YouTube. You can find us by searching for KUOW Public Radio. We've got Seattle City Council Insight writer Kevin Schofield. Kevin, great to have you. Thanks.
Hey, Bill. It's great to be back.
Crosscut reporter David Kroman, welcome back. Thank you.
Hi, Bill. Thanks for having me.
I'm looking out my window to the east at clouds on day, I think it's 42 now of no rain since March. I think that's the most days on record, that stretch. I do know we've gotten like 7 inches of rain since March, and that makes this the driest season in 77 years of record keeping. And yet I've also been loving the weather, I have to say, not smoky, but will it ever rain again? How about you? How you doing this summer? Still officially summer.
I saw some mist this morning at my house, so we're getting little hints of fall. I think that's good.
Mist.
Yeah, I think there's forecast. I think in Western Washington will be okay, but I'm really thinking about Eastern Washington and where all the fires are. And I think there is rain forecast in Yakima and some of the towns over there that really desperately need it. So fingers crossed for them.
We did have a little overnight rain a few nights ago, and but yesterday everybody is saying was really the last super warm day. Right at this point, like we are really transitioning into fall.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a swamp creature by birth, and so this like long dry period has essentially like robbed me of all my natural functions. So I'm gonna kind of come to life like a fish that gets tossed into a puddle whenever it starts raining.
It'll be good to have you back. I mean, I like this version of you, so just wait. Okay, yeah. So let's catch you up, listeners, on the news of the week. We'll start with the pandemic in case you don't like to spend your week immersed in COVID news. We've done that for you. We're going to, first of all, the big national news. President Biden made the vaccine mandatory for not only federal employees and federal contractors, but private employers with more than 100 workers have to require those workers to get vaccinated or take weekly virus tests. So that total order applies to like 100 million people. In Washington, our biggest state employee union reached a tentative agreement with the governor. Seattle has not reached an agreement with its unions on vaccine mandates. Who wants to give us an update on how that's going? Do we think the Seattle deal is going to be pretty much the same as the state? What's hanging it up? What should we know about this?
I can jump in on this, having just chatted with people from the union coalition in Seattle, which is to say that in many ways the purpose of the agreement that the Washington Federation of State Employees just reached with the governor's office is the same as the goal of the coalition of city unions here, which is to buy some time and also to kind of incentivize workers to get vaccinated if they aren't already. So, for instance, an employee might apply for an exemption by September 12th on the state level, September 22nd on the city level, get turned down, and then need to schedule a vaccination appointment. So part of the negotiations are about buying time for that. Someone might get an exemption, and then their department would decide that there's no reasonable way to accommodate them if they aren't vaccinated. And so they have to choose between leaving their job or getting vaccinated. They need to buy time for that. And then there are also going to be, efforts on the local level, as there were on the state level, to incentivize people to get vaccinated. On the state level, that's like an additional vacation day. On the city level, they were asking for an additional vacation, the floating vacation, and it doesn't seem like that's on the table. So financial incentives are now also up for consideration. But that's sort of the gist of what people are after.
Yeah, we're in an interesting time. Our summer fun. Remember back at the beginning of the summer when everybody's getting vaccinated and we could go out and things opened. Summer fun is over, right? Delta's rampant. Hospitals are getting overrun. Vaccine immunity is starting to fade for the people who got them earliest. Still have kids under 12 not vaccinated. We're new worries about long COVID. And so, I look at what the president and the governor are doing, and and even at the city level, and I interpret a lot of it as they're trying to do whatever they can to avoid having to shut everything down again, because things are actually looking pretty bad at the moment. And I think the negotiations are interesting. There are some things that the unions have asked for that I think are completely reasonable. As Paul pointed out, buying more time where necessary. So let's really kind of work this out and make sure it works for everybody. And things like, for the people who, are laid up for a couple of days after they get that second vaccine shot. I know I was for a couple of days. If the government's going to mandate it, then they should give them a couple extra sick days for it. I'm less happy about them asking for more money, because it feels, to be quite honest, a little bit like extortion, saying, oh yeah, we're not going to go get vaccinated unless you give us more money. Right?
What's the union's version of that? What's their argument for why they ought to get more, not just accommodations that you just talked about, but more money too?
Paul,
yeah, it's kind of along the lines of just giving people a reason. I mean, ultimately in union leadership, there are a lot of people who want their members to be vaccinated, who, either want to be in workplaces where other people are vaccinated or don't want their coworkers to leave. And so the more you can incentivize people to get the vaccine, who knows if money actually works, but that's, part of the thinking there. But, it certainly is up for debate whether it's extortion or just an effective way to convince people to get vaccinated.
Union negotiations, it's hard to read into. You sort of, from my perspective, you sort of have to look at what the end product ends up being, because both sides in union negotiations say all sorts of things, make things sound a lot worse than they might be, certain things better, and it's a lot of, somebody who has been engaged in my own workplace's union negotiations, there's a lot of theater and back and forth, and people saying big things to kind of get to where they want to be. And so, maybe asking for more money is, you put stuff on the table so that you have stuff to take off the table. We hear a lot from the unions about threats of mass exoduses, and we've seen some threats of sick outs and things like that. And, again, in the same vein, it's sort of this point to take seriously. And what of it is just sort of, some posturing to get the best deal for union members. And I don't know that we will see the answer to that until all of these agreements are hammered out. My hunch, like what Paul was saying, is the city agreement will look fairly similar to the state agreement, which is they're not getting raises, they're not getting more money, but they are getting some more time and a little more flexibility to make these shots actually doable for people.
Yeah, I think it's probably likely, and I think that'd be a great outcome if that's what happens.
One of the things that's still very much up in the air that, it has nothing to do with incentives, is how the exemption requests are going to be processed. So at the moment, from what I gather, and this is kind of stuff I got on background, there have been roughly 100 employees who have requested exemptions thus far, and the paperwork went out this past weekend. Of those, like 80 were religious exemptions and 20 were medical exemptions. And then the city is going to have to figure out how it approves or denies the requests. And so at the moment, we don't know if that's going to be done in a centralized, like anonymous form, or whether it'll be handled, department by department. And then beyond that, and obviously this brings up due process questions, like would certain departments be more prone to, approving or denying exemption requests than others? And then once you get beyond that, once you get to the process of coming up with accommodations for people who aren't vaccinated, whether it's for a religious or medical reason, you kind of run into the same issue. Presumably, the accommodations process has to be handled on a department by department level, because the job of someone at Seattle City Light is so different from the job of someone at Seattle Police Department. And if the department someone works in can't figure out a way to accommodate them, if someone's in a very public facing role, they have to come back to the office, et cetera, then even if they get an exemption, they still might have to leave their job if they don't get vaccinated. So that whole nexus is in the works right now, and the negotiations are fairly far along, but that'll kind of be a make or break point in them.
I thought it was really interesting that at the federal level, the mandate includes an option for weekly testing instead. And unfortunately, what's going on with Delta, and we'll see what happens with this new Mu variant, is that they found very clearly that the Delta variant leads people to be contagious much earlier than previous versions of it. Within in many cases like 48 hours of contracting the virus, and at least a day earlier than before in terms of when they start showing symptoms. So weekly testing, honestly, isn't going to help, right? If that's what's being, put out there as an alternative to vaccination, it's purely performative, because weekly testing is not going to make a difference in terms of stopping the spread of COVID in any significant way.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the city, and that's going to go on all over the place. Does your fate depend on your office's style, your boss's opinions? All that stuff gets kind of weird. Did you see Portland exempted its police department from their mandate? I guess the state of Oregon said that the governor's order for healthcare workers doesn't apply to police, that providing medical care isn't their job. But in Seattle, could that happen in Seattle, or is it definite that the police union's going to have to be under vaccine mandate?
I'd been talking to somebody in the mayor's office when that story came out. I read about it in OPB. We were talking about something unrelated, but we were wrapping up and I brought it up.
OPB meaning Oregon Public Broadcasting.
Right.
Yeah.
Want to give a public media plug here.
Yeah.
But when, I brought it up and I asked her, is this something that is Seattle going to consider something like that? And she kind of laughed and really dismissed that as a possibility. I mean, we haven't, I think Portland's decision was kind of based in this, in some legal advice. And as far as I know, they have executive sessions all the time, so we don't know what legal advice they're getting. But my sense is so far they have not received any kind of similar legal advice that it would be a good idea for them to exempt the police department. And we haven't, that if you're a city worker and you're not vaccinated, the deadline for getting your first shot is coming up here in a couple of days, because you need to be fully vaccinated, which means you get both shots and then you wait a week. So for Pfizer or Moderna, that's, a month and a bit. And so the fact that we haven't heard any sort of rumblings that anyone's going to be exempted from this, and people need to start getting their shots here in like 2 days, maybe even Sunday. I don't expect that we would see anything similar in Seattle.
The legal side of this. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Paul.
Oh, I was going to say, just anecdotally, I'm told that a notable chunk of the people who have applied for exemptions thus far have come from SPD. There are, of course, people in SPD who are, actively pro-vax and want their colleagues to get vaccinated. But at the same time, there's some unknown officer put up posters in at least one precinct saying, don't share your vaccination information with the city, stand together, et cetera. So there's a split of opinion within that department, but certainly not. It shouldn't be thought of as the department that is wholly anti-vax.
And legally, they really, the people opposing sort of vaccination mandates, as far as I can tell, really don't have a leg to stand on at all. And even the exemption stuff, I think the city and state and federal government, it really sort of tips in their favor. There are 115 years of Supreme Court precedents that consistently support the government's ability to mandate vaccines, going back to 1905 smallpox vaccine, and just Supreme Court has said it over and over and over again. So it's going to be very, very tough for any of these anti-vaccination mandate groups to win in court.
What about for students? Did you see Los Angeles is requiring the vaccine for all students 12 and above? They're the first city in the country to do it. Do you think that's where Seattle's going?
I think it's very likely.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised. Just to backtrack a little bit, respond to Kevin. Also, the Coalition of City Unions hasn't said that the mandate is illegal. They just wanted to bargain the effects. So I'm not sure there is anyone on the union leadership level who is claiming that the mandate is illegal or would try to challenge it in court.
Well, I wouldn't put it past SPOG.
That would be the Seattle Police Officers Guild, by the way. Yeah. I'm just basically serving as the acronym translator today. It's my main duty. Okay, before we leave COVID, I would love to leave COVID, but there were rumors this week that state ferry workers who oppose vaccine mandates would stage a sick out. You wouldn't be able to travel on Labor Day, by ferry. Do you think that journalists like us, did we overhype that rumor? I mean, could there be less opposition to vaccine mandates than we think? We talked earlier about, was that just kind of a union talking point, or was that legit? I guess it didn't turn out to be legit, but what do you all make of that as journalists?
Yeah, and it's the same question with Seattle City Light. There was another story saying there was going to be a big sick out there, and it didn't really happen. I go back and forth on these things. I can see merit for both arguments. I mean, if you're a ferry rider, and we'll probably get into this conversation more, and you're thinking about what weekend, you kind of want to know in advance if people are talking about not showing. I don't think it's necessarily irresponsible, but if it is sort of a leverage thing that the unions are trying to deploy, then getting more press certainly does help them. I mean, we didn't cover it, might have if there had been an actual sick out, but I can see arguments on both sides.
Yeah. I think it's also,
yes, go ahead, Paul.
I think it's easy to overestimate the proportion of people who are anti-vax in the city labor sphere or the state labor sphere, because unions have to represent all their members. And so if they have, even if it's a relatively small portion of their members who don't want to get vaccinated, they still have to represent them, which then gives the impression, potentially to some people outside, that the unions are vaccination skeptics, but that isn't inherently true.
Okay, good point. Since I did bring up the ferry system, there have been ferry boat delays and cancellations for quite a while before the vaccine mandates. And I wanted to ask you about that. David, you live on the Kitsap Peninsula?
Yeah, I live in Kingston.
Yeah.
I mean, it's tough for. The Kingston Edmonds route has been okay, but the Bainbridge Seattle route and the Bremerton route have been disasters all summer, which is the confluence of a lot of things. One being ships that have a lot of maintenance that has not been done, and it takes a really long time to bring new boats online. The construction on Coleman Dock in Seattle has been really disruptive, but I think the kind of both of those are sort of concrete things that will, in theory, eventually be resolved. The sort of more stubborn question is the staffing question. And we're seeing this in all kinds of blue collar sectors right now. And to a certain extent, just in all government sectors as well, which is the kind of, silver wave of people who are retirement eligible. Speaking of the city unions, I was talking to someone from the Coalition of City Unions, and I think 3 years ago, 26% of the city of Seattle workforce was retirement age eligible. And that's a pretty similar story in all, I think, public sectors, and especially in the ferry system. They're having a really hard time replacing people and finding new people. And then, I think when COVID happened, a lot of people took some steps away from work, or put on took some leave, maybe even some people were furloughed. And then I think a lot of people just didn't come back. Part of it also aided by the fact that despite everything, the stock market did really well. So people's retirement portfolios suddenly look okay. And so it's a really tricky problem that, I think some people will argue the vaccine mandates will exacerbate, but that's kind of fringe for me. I mean, it's a much more deep-seated problem than whether or not the vaccine mandates is going to cause a labor shortage.
It's been particularly problematic for Washington State Ferries because they did, in fact, have a lot of their crew retired during COVID, as David was talking about. And the training and certification requirements for ferry workers are pretty onerous. They have to go through a whole set of maritime crew certification. And so it takes months. It's not like they can just, put out an ad and hire some folks and recruit this. It takes them a very, very long time to get folks through the pipeline, in some ways similar to law enforcement and actually even Seattle City Light line workers, right? Yep. People are going to be, climbing up those poles, working on those lines.
Not to mention that the early phase of someone's career as a Washington State ferry worker is something called the on-call system, which would require an early career deckhand to essentially drive like anywhere along the edge of the Puget Sound to be available for like to meet a boat. It's not very well paid, and it's arduous work, and it's kind of hard to come up with a consistent living situation. And it's, I don't know the logistics of ferries and ferry hiring, but I can't really imagine there's a way to boost recruitment without reconsidering how we deploy early career deckhands to make it a more desirable job.
Yeah,
Okay.
growing up,
Go
I grew up on Bainbridge, and you would not see late ferries, and if you did, it was 5 to 10 minutes at most. In fact, at one point when I was young, they were running 3 ferries between Seattle and Bainbridge, so you had this ferries every 20 minutes. This summer, it was consistently 35, 45 minutes late, these boats. I mean, they were halfway through the day just canceling a route so that they would just become sort of on time again, but only because they were so late. They were like, had been bumped to the next route. And that is just, I grew up here. I've been a ferry person my entire life, and that has never, ever been the case. It's really uniquely bad right now.
Well, so in my experience, living part-time in the San Juans for the last 20 years, is that, until they put in the reservation system a couple of years ago, every summer, the ferries are running late every single day. And it would get exacerbated when a boat broke down. And when they're running all day, the boats do in fact break down. And some of the issues that David was talking about they're just behind in building new boats has exacerbated the problem. But it really, in a lot of ways, went away a couple of years ago, but it came back in spades this summer with the crewing shortages, where they, like down here, have been canceling things, and where it's a major inconvenience, in the South Sound for the San Juan Islands. That's how people get to medical appointments in Bellingham and Anacortes and places like that. And so, it in some cases is a life or death situation for them if they can't do that. And there's no option to drive the long way around the peninsula if you can't get on that boat to make your doctor appointment in Bellingham from Orcas Island.
That's true in Vashon too. I mean, I think the average age in Vashon is over the age of 55. It's, rural areas are uniquely accident prone, and there's no hospital. And so, if you're on Vashon and the ferry's delayed, you can get to Tacoma or Seattle, but you might be stuck and dying in an ambulance. So
yeah. I lived on Vashon in high school, and I used to actually go by I had the little paper fold up schedules of whether I was going to go to the Tahlequah Ferry in the south end or the Fauntleroy Ferry in the north end. And you're just listening to you is making me realize I haven't checked a ferry schedule. I don't know when, because you don't know how long the line is going to be. You don't know what the delay is going to be. Just get there as soon as you can and hang out. So feels like a relic of my youth when I used a ferry schedule. Anyway, we got to move on. Speaking of schedules, as we continue with the week in review, Bill Radke here, and we've got Paul Kiefer with Publicola, Kevin Schofield with Seattle City Council Insight, David Kroman with Crosscut, and you too, if you'll hang on. We'll be right back.
Support for KUOW comes from Bartell Drugs, helping to protect family and community health by offering seasonal flu shots at all 67 locations. Appointments booked online at bartelldrugs.com, and walk-ins welcome at all locations.
There may be only one thing better than listening to KUOW.
And that's showing your passion for public radio by working for KUOW.
Right now, we're hiring for a number of staff positions,
all listed on our website.
KUOW believes attracting and supporting a diverse staff
is crucial to serving the communities where we live and work.
Black and Indigenous people,
people of color, people with disabilities,
veterans, and members of the LGBTQ+ community
are highly encouraged to apply.
Get started at kuow.org/careers.
Yeah, come work with us here at KUOW 94.9, Seattle's NPR news station. 64 degrees and cloudy in Seattle. It's 12:30, and it's KUOW's Week in Review.
This is Bill Radke bringing you the Week in Review with Kevin Schofield, David Kroman, and Paul Kiefer. And this week, Seattle's mayor said the city council overstepped some boundaries when they passed a bill to limit police tactics. The sponsors of the bill say this new bill is meant to restrict officers' use of crowd control weapons, blast balls, tear gas, pepper spray. But Mayor Jenny Durkan is so down on this bill that she returned it to the council unsigned. So it'll take effect, but Durkan says it's not going to actually do anything.
It's important for the public to understand what the clear rules are. It's important for officers to understand what the clear rules are. And council passed something claiming it made changes when they know it doesn't make a single change.
Who can explain this? What does Mayor Durkan mean that a bill is passed and it won't do anything? It won't make any change?
Oh boy. So let's see. In the letter that she sent back when she returned it unsigned, she listed a bunch of complaints. It was a pretty good laundry list. Some of the things, are things we've heard before. A couple new things in there. She said that, that I think she was saying that Judge Robart, who oversees the 2012 consent decree against the police department, is likely to throw this out, and the Department of Justice and the court-appointed police monitor also is likely to have big problems with this. So it may not go anywhere. But she said things like, the city charter says that management of SPD and its policies, setting policies is the responsibility of the chief of police and not the city council to go do that. Okay. That it's potentially a violation of the separation of powers because this, less lethal weapons ban ordinance, says that it doesn't go into effect until the Judge Robart approves it, right? But this actually came up in the court cases around Tim Eyman's Initiative 976 that said that, some parts of, defeasing bonds only took effect if, the local government chose to go ahead and get rid of certain bonds. And they said, look, the legislative branch can't delegate its legislative responsibility to another branch of government, right? Okay. It said, this violates the processes that were laid out in the consent decree for how SPD's policies were supposed to get changed, and it forces SPD to propose and defend to the judge policies that it doesn't like and doesn't agree with. And
but why would the city council pass something that, if the mayor's right that it doesn't do anything, why would the city council pass it?
I can answer this a little bit. So the original bill, which came up last summer, was so restrictive that the DOJ did indeed challenge it. And it was a bill that placed stronger restrictions, I should say, on the use of less lethal weapons, or quote unquote crowd control weapons, by SPD in crowd control context.
And again, that's tear gas, blast balls, pepper spray,
weapons, rubber bullets, that kind of thing. Yeah. Right. So Judge Robart placed an injunction on the implementation of that bill. And actually, it's not really. It's complicated because it's not actually that the court can block the law itself, but that the court can block the law or the policies that SPD proposes that align with the terms of the bill. So in any case, the council went back and revised this original bill in accordance with the concerns of the DOJ and the court-appointed monitor. And so Councilmember Herbold, who's the chair of the Public Safety Committee, met with the DOJ, met with the court-appointed monitor, whose name is Dr. Oftley, to talk, get informal guidance about how to tweak the bill so that it wouldn't raise the same alarms at the DOJ if it got passed in the future. So, for instance, they gave officers some more leeway to use pepper spray in a more targeted way against people who are breaking law, as opposed to, as a tool to move crowds, or, a tool to use indiscriminately against crowds. And so the council got sign off from the city attorney's office, and in their view, they, these informal meetings with the DOJ and the monitor were enough, that was all enough to kind of iron out the problems with the original bill so that it would stand up when SPD had to bring policies before the court that adhered to the new bill. So in any case, there's a disagreement about whether, between the mayor and the council, about whether those sessions with the DOJ and the monitoring team were substantial, whether the edits made fully addressed the DOJ's concerns. Mm-hmm. And the mayor is presuming, or kind of assuming that the most likely scenario is they didn't address the DOJ's concerns. And what the council is saying is, it's not illegal because we got the city attorney sign up on this. And for what we know, as far as we know, we addressed the DOJ's concerns. The DOJ can't comment on the legislation itself. So we're going to have to wait until SPD wraps up, these draft policies. They had 60 days from the time the thing was passed. So it's actually in the air.
For someone listening to us who's is so in the weeds of which, that's the story, right? It's that those are the details. So we understand. But David, do you have anything to add for someone listening who wants to know what, how are police going to treat demonstrators differently for when all this is done, or political fallout? This was a unanimous, all the city councilors who are running for re-election, including Lorena Gonzalez running for mayor, they voted, I believe, right? It was unanimous. So they all voted for this bill. What else should we know, David?
My whole context for this is that what we're kind of seeing is the city council of today sort of legislating against the city council of 2010, or like city hall of 2010, which is our notion of what police reform looked like when we invited a federal judge to come in and oversee changing our police department looked a lot different than it does today. And in some ways, what that judge is tasked with doing is a fairly narrow task, which is, be constitutional. Don't be an unconstitutional police force. But now the city hall and stuff is talking about sort of broader changes and a little more holistic. But we still have this sort of old model of what police reform looks like hanging around. And those two things have a kind of awkward relationship with each other. And that's what we're seeing, I think, sort of wrapped up in this blast ball, less lethal weapon debate, is like what constitutes police reform? Is it the sort of changes that people, demanded and thought were necessary in 2010, a very top-down approach, a judge sort of saying, this is what police reform needs to be, and if you don't do it, I'm going to get really angry? Or is police reform, which is, I would argue, kind of what we're more seeing of 2020 and 21, something that happens from, the streets and protests and pressure on City Hall to make fairly dramatic changes? And, I think those two things have only just now kind of started to come in conflict with each other, and it's going to be interesting to see how they resolve that conflict.
I think David's spot on, and there's kind of another layer too of that, which is in 2012, when the consent decree was signed, and by the way, it was negotiated by Jenny Durkin back when she was the U.S. attorney for Western Washington. Mm-hmm. There were certain principles about how one reforms law enforcement, right? What kind of data you need to collect, the kinds of actions that you would typically force law enforcement to go through to reform their behavior. And and we seem to be on a path where, for almost all of the components of that, SPD had been making very solid progress. And then what we discovered last summer was that there were really still very big gaps. And the things that we've been asking SPD to do, in a lot of ways, didn't really fix the problems. The biggest problem being biased policing against minorities in the city. And that wasn't a total surprise, because one of the areas that had been studied was around what is there continued sort of discriminatory behavior in who the police stops and who gets ticketed and things like that. And the data showed very clearly that even 2018, 2019, last year, those discriminatory practices were continuing. And they studied why, and they came back and said, actually, we don't have a really good idea as to why, but they are still really continuing on. So, in those aspects, the consent decree really didn't achieve it. Well, it achieved many, many things. And, overall, for example, the use of force by SPD has reduced dramatically. What use of force remain is still highly biased, right? So there were important problems the consent decree set out to solve that did not get solved, right? And I think that's a part of what we're reckoning with now. It's this consent decree we have right now isn't going to get us across the finish line. And so what do we have to change to get where we really need to go?
Okay. Yeah, I'm keeping us on a Washington State Ferry-esque schedule as it is. So a couple other pieces of city news. Some University of Washington researchers said this week that Seattle's tax on sugary beverages might not be getting us to drink less of it. We've had this tax for 3 years, $1.75 an ounce on soda, sports drinks, energy drinks, teas, coffees, juices. It was supposed to reduce consumption and also pay for healthy eating education. And when the pandemic hit, the city used the soda tax money to give emergency supermarket vouchers to families. Among higher income residents, though, sugary beverage consumption actually increased since it went into effect. But Kevin, didn't consumption go down when at first, but now that's done? Is that
yeah?
The deal?
So we should just preface by saying these kinds of evaluations of like what's happening with consumption are really just notoriously difficult to do well, because you basically have to prove a counterfactual. You have to figure out like what would have happened in Seattle if the soda tax hadn't been passed, right? And then compare that with what really did happen. And since we can't go back in time and see what happened in an alternate universe, they have to try to figure out, well, what's a good what's a comparable city or set of cities to look at. And at this point, the most obvious comparable cities, ones like San Francisco, that are match up sort of basic demographics, educational levels, sort of political leanings, all those things. Most of them actually have soda taxes too, so we can't use them as a counterfactual of this. So they ended up sort of in this latest study putting together a weird kind of agglomeration of other cities, starting with Minneapolis, which is a common point of reference, but some other smaller cities too, to try to do comparison. The last study they did before this one that you mentioned found, like in 2018, it looked like consumption had gone down a lot here, but it went down the same amount in the comparable cities. So it's like, well, that doesn't mean the soda tax made any difference. And this year, what they're saying, looking at 2019 numbers, is there's a little bit of a decrease for low-income residents in Seattle, a little bit of an increase for higher-income residents in Seattle, but the comparison data is just weird. In fact, looking at it, it looks like, consumption of sugary beverages went up 15 points between 2007 and 2019. You look at that and go, okay, that doesn't make any sense. But so the bigger picture here is there's still been no evidence at all that the soda tax has actually reduced consumption here. So, I mean, there were two parts of the promise that they made when they passed this. And they had to make a promise because the problem with this tax is it's highly, highly regressive, right? It's well known, well documented. Nobody sort of really seriously argues otherwise that soda and other sugar beverages are marketed to and consumed disproportionately by low-income communities, right? So if you tax them, then the impact of that tax is higher on low-income communities than it is on higher-income communities, and that makes it regressive. There's no argument that it's regressive. And they knew that at the time they passed the tax. So the deal they made was to say, okay, we're going to pass this tax and we're going to ensure that the revenues that are collected from this are invested back into low-income communities on health programs, on early intervention, childhood intervention programs, to try to make sure that we're creating a healthier environment for kids out of this. And that second part, the investing the money, with the exception of an emergency last year with COVID, has largely happened. But if the first part, the consumption of sugar beverages going down, didn't happen, now all we're left with is a tax on poor people to pay for programs for poor people.
Okay, good summary. So Paul or David, does anyone think that this news that the money's coming in and it's getting spent, but it's not reducing consumption, does that mean the city's going to reconsider the tax, pull the tax, no effect at all? What's the upshot?
I guess what's on my mind. Oh, go ahead, David. Sorry.
I mean, this is I think this is the calculation that the city hall makes a lot, which is it is a progressive city council, a progressive mayor in a state with a highly regressive tax system, and so this is kind of another. I mean, they do this calculation and these battles all the time with sales tax and property tax. We, just are funding community college and pre-K with a property tax, and maybe a property tax is not quite as regressive as sales or soda tax, but it is mostly considered a pretty regressive tax. And so the city hall is just always making these calculations of like, is the regressive nature of this tax we want to do worth it to do sort of the progressive things we want to do? I know when you ask any of them, nobody in City Hall likes it. They all wish they could do an income tax or a tax on rich people in Seattle, but they can't, at least not yet, depending on what happens with capital gains too at state. So what they're left with are, if they want more money to do the things they want to do, they mostly have to turn to regressive taxes. And the city council, when they passed the soda tax, calculated they thought it was worth it, that these programs were going to be effective and helpful enough that it was worth putting some tax on soda. And I have yet to see, well, I don't think since 2009 or 2010 has the city council voted to repeal a tax that it has put on place. So, I think it's here for now.
Okay. Paul, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is more of a question, but I'm curious to on what level this could parallel other regressive taxes that are intended to change behavior. So for instance, if we began to toll people for driving through downtown, and put the revenue from that into expansions of bus rapid transit, something along those lines, is it more difficult to change or to, I guess, incentivize people not to drink sugary beverages than it is to incentivize people to ride public transit, given what kind of spending options you have for the revenue you get from those taxes that you use as disincentives or incentives? So it might be easier to convince people to ride bus rapid transit because they see the buses, zipping by car gridlock, than it is to convince people to stop drinking sugary beverages because there's nothing quite as dramatic to provide a contrast. But I'm not sure if that actually bears out in reality.
Yeah, and Seattle's a really interesting place for this. So when they tolled 520, when they put the tolls back in 520, there was a short-term drop in traffic across the bridge. But over the course of the next couple of years, it basically bounced back to what it was before that, right? So, and this is the funny thing about soda taxes, because they are in places in a bunch of cities and now. And what the studies on them have shown is that they actually have an impact in some cities, and they don't in others. And the researchers have no idea what the difference is, and they have no predictive ability to say it's going to work here or not here. So Berkeley, it seems to be having an effect. Right next door in Oakland, no effect. Right. And they just don't know why a soda tax works in some places and doesn't work in others.
Okay. That's the latest from UW researchers as they keep tracking the effect or possibly the unknowable non-effect of this city soda tax. Okay, we've got to take a short break and we're going to come right back. We're going to mark a terrible anniversary and also find a reason to smile when we return.
.949 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:49. Stay with us after We Can Review for BBC NewsHour. Here's the BBC's Julian Marshall with a preview of what you'll hear during the 1 o'clock hour.
On today's program, a billionaire businessman is to head a new government in Lebanon amid an economic meltdown. And a New York firefighter remembers the 9/11 attacks in which hundreds of his colleagues were among the thousands who died.
That's BBC NewsHour this afternoon at 1 o'clock, just about 10 minutes from now.
Support for KUOW comes from Geico, offering car insurance as well as services for homeowners and renters through the Geico Insurance Agency. More at 1-800-947-AUTO.
64 degrees in Seattle. Clouds is the forecast for this afternoon and a high of 70 degrees. Now back to KUOW's Week in Review.
This is Bill Radke, as I'm talking now on Friday with Crosscut's David Kroman, Seattle City Council Insights' Kevin Schofield, and Publicola's Paul Kiefer. It is the day before the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. City of Seattle's planning a small ceremony to honor the victims. Port of Seattle firefighters made a memorial at SeaTac Airport. How are you thinking about this 20-year anniversary? Paul, I'd like to start with you.
I was 3 years old, just shy of 4 years old when the towers fell. So I have no memory of that day. I don't really know what life was like before it. I have a very clear memory of things like the Newtown shooting or the Orlando shooting or Trayvon Martin shooting, that sort of thing. This is sort of a weird reflection on it, but I converted to Islam when I was 14, so like more than a decade after the towers fell. And I don't know if this is something that a lot of other sort of post 9/11 Muslim converts share, but I have a kind of a constant insecurity about whether someone will question why I made that decision, post 9/11. And I don't really owe anyone an explanation, and there's no direct connection between the two events, but it's an anxiety I have. And I also have this kind of, I don't think it's a unique experience, but, part of my coming of age when I, when I became an adult was having people ask me if I was an informant in mosques, because the Patriot Act has, left a really deep imprint on our community. And not that there weren't informants in mosques in the, in the 60s and 70s when the FBI was going after the Nation of Islam, but, it feels like it's, especially converts are particularly suspect in the post-Patriot Act era, because we were used very often to spy on people. So, it's colored my life in that sense. But again, I don't really know what it felt like to experience the change in and of itself in that day or in that week.
And how has the experience changed in those years since your conversion to now 20 years out from 9/11?
A part of growing up, I was in the strange position of converting when I was, basically still in puberty. So, part of growing up and having to kind of come to terms with the political reality of the decision I made, which, at the time was mostly about finding community. But, as I got older, I really had to grapple with what it means politically, is that, you fall into this, I've had to fall into this kind of culture war. It's not really a war, that's too dramatic of a way to phrase it. But there is sort of an internal cultural battle about, how much should we embrace sort of patriotism and the notion of building a distinctly American Muslim cultural identity to set us apart from other people versus, how much should we sort of be the bridge between Muslims elsewhere in the world who get otherized and Muslims here, et cetera. And being a convert, naturally, I'm like seen as, I feel like I'm supposed to be some sort of conduit for, one or both of those sides. And it's a far more anxiety-inducing experience than I anticipated when I was 14.
Mm-hmm. David, you were saying that we can't separate a 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks from the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Right. Because, there's, on the one hand, there's the kind of memorial side of the 20th anniversary, which is reflecting on this singular event of 9/11, but there's the much more active marking of the 20th anniversary, which is that Afghanistan is it is what it is. It's been a disaster. Iraq has been a disaster. I mean, it's 20 years on. The people who are really living with the consequences of 9/11 don't live in the United States. They live in Afghanistan and they live in Iraq, and that, I think, is a much more powerful marker of the last 20 years than the ceremonies will be. Ceremonies, not saying they're not necessary. I mean, of course, I want to, remember that specific day, but also want to keep in our minds and our hearts the people who live in the places that the United States came into and then left, both in chaos.
Kevin, you were telling me you're also thinking about what's happening to democracy.
Oh yeah, and I have so many feelings about 9/11. I was up early that morning. I was watching breaking news after the first plane had hit the first twin tower, and there was smoke coming out, and the anchors had no idea. Like, there was still much confusion about what had actually happened, and then watching live as the second plane hit and realizing just like the full realization of what was actually going on, and then having to go wake up my kids to get ready for school and tell them what was going on that day. That's going to live with me for the rest of my life. But just thinking back about sort of the context of what the United States and the world was going through at the time, in 2001, the United States was really the only recognized global superpower, right? Russia was still kind of in disarray after the breakup of the Soviet Union. China was starting to open up, but was really sort of not in full sort of superpower mode at that point. And we were kind of seen as the beacon for spreading democracy throughout the world. And in many ways, because we were the global superpower, we were kind of seen as invincible, right? As kind of untouchable. And 2001 kind of showed that America was not in fact invincible, right? That you could get us and you could hurt us in ways that really, resonated. And then our reaction to that, in a lot of ways, undermined the message that we were the beacon of democracy around the world, because our worst instincts came out in a lot of ways, right? We, invaded Afghanistan quickly. We, came up with some reasons to invade Iraq. And it's not like there weren't people in the United States at the time who were saying, hey, we're going to invade Afghanistan. That has never worked out for anyone to go invade Afghanistan. Why do we do that? And we're going to invade Iraq. What does Iraq have to do with this, with what happened 9/11 at all? And those people were shouted down. And we went and did those things anyway and demonstrated to the world that maybe we weren't necessarily sort of the beacon of freedom that we thought we were. And then, so 20 years later, we look back and say, is democracy advancing or retreating around the world? And there's a good argument to be made that it's in retreat, right? Look at what's going on in Russia, China, Middle Eastern countries, now including Afghanistan, and even here at home, where we're busy passing voter restrictions and civil liberties restrictions. And, I think 9/11 hurt our image at the time and hurt our standing in the world and probably hurt the cause of democracy. And we have yet to figure out sort of what our new role in the world is going to be, where this sort of American exceptionalism is a shattered myth, and we can go back to being a force for good. I know it's kind of Debbie Downer to talk about that way, but I think we still have a lot of reckoning to do.
Well, speaking of Debbie Downer, how do you, we're at the end of our show. I ask the same question at the end of the show every week. Given that backdrop of the kind of world we're living in, did you smile this week? Is there a reason to smile that you want to pass on to a listener as we say goodbye?
Oh, well, for me, it's the Kraken Iceplex is open up today, right?
That's right.
Up in Northgate. And,
Climate Pledge Arena.
Well, yeah, the Iceplex, the practice facility that's going to be open to the public for ice skating, all that opens up today. I think I'm not sure about the name.
Kraken in Northgate.
Yeah, up in Northgate.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the name Kraken Iceplex, because it's either an awesome dessert or maybe the thing that's finally going to take down humanity. It's kind of hard, but
Yes.
I'm excited to go. Actually, I haven't been ice skating in a long time. Looking forward to going and doing that.
Oh, that's awesome. Anything else you want to smile at before we go?
As long as we're doing sports, I'll say it has been a long time since I feel like the Mariners had a shot at the playoffs. And so feeling, even if they don't make it, which I feel like odds are against that they will, it's been a competitive, it's, September and we're still talking about them. And that is a win.
Yes, that is a win.
Not sports related at all, but I get around mostly on foot, and I have been running into this orange cat named George Michael, who's really friendly pretty often. So if one of the listeners today is the owner of a cat named George Michael, who's extremely friendly and has a bizarre meow, thank you. I really appreciate what George Michael brings into my life.
Wham. Thank you for that, Paul. That's Paul Kiefer, criminal justice reporter at Publicola, with Crosscut reporter David Kroman, and Seattle City Council Insight writer and co-host of the Seattle News, Views, and Brews podcast, Kevin Schofield. And I love that you come together with us on Fridays. Thank you so much for being Week in Review today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Our show is produced by Alec Cowan and Sarah Leibovitz, social media and live streaming by Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Tio Popescu. Thank you for listening. Let's do it again next Friday.